Welcome to a journey into one of the darkest and most unsettling stories ever recorded in the Ozarks of Missouri. Before we begin, drop a comment sharing where you're tuning in from and what time you're hearing this. It's always fascinating to see when and where these stories find their audience. The year was 1900 and the Ozark Mountains loomed as they always had, ancient, quiet, and secretive. In Washington County, where the Big River carves its way through limestone cliffs, stood a wooden trestle bridge known to locals as Sutton's Crossing. Official maps called it Bridge Number 27, but no one in Irondale ever used that name. To them it was the Widowmaker, or worse, the gateway to hell. Built in 1879 to link mining sites across a deep gorge, the bridge itself was ordinary in design. What set it apart was its haunting atmosphere. The ravine below dropped nearly 60 feet into dark, fast-moving water that echoed in strange ways. Early geological surveys described the sound as eerily human, like distant voices locked in argument. Those who approached the bridge often spoke of an unnatural silence. Birds stopped singing. The wind went still. Between 1888 and 1901, at least 17 incidents were reported near that site: disappearances, sudden breakdowns, and unexplainable behavior. The first case involved a mail carrier, Thomas Holloway, whose horse refused to step onto the bridge in May 1888. The animal threw him off and bolted. Holloway walked the rest of his route later, telling witnesses he felt something following him home. 3 days after that, he quit his job, sold his house at a loss, and vanished into Illinois. No one heard from him again. In the summer of 1892, 3 more events shook the area. On June 12th, farmer Ezekiel Morrison said he heard voices inside his own head as he crossed the bridge at sunset. He couldn't make out the words, but the experience terrified him enough to add 7 miles to his usual route just to avoid it. A few weeks later, on July 1st, midwife Abigail Waywright was found wandering near the bridge at dawn, confused and muttering about voices in the woods. By the next day, she remembered nothing. The third case was the most chilling. William Dyer, a carpenter repairing the western railing that July, worked for 3 days without issue. But that final evening, he returned to his boarding house, sat silently through dinner, and never spoke another word. The next morning, William Dyer returned to the bridge, even though his work there was finished. When he didn't come back that night, neighbors organized a search. They found his tools neatly lined up in the center of the bridge and a single trail of footprints leading toward the southern railing, then stopping abruptly. Despite days of searching the river and woods, Dyer was never found. His disappearance became one of 27 unsolved cases recorded in Washington County between 1879 and 1917. Afterward, county officials posted warning signs near the bridge, urging travelers not to linger, especially after dark. No official inquiry followed. Disappearances were sadly common in the isolated Ozarks. Still, locals grew uneasy. Those who crossed the bridge did so quickly, often whispering a prayer or clutching a charm. Some refused to cross alone under any circumstance. What truly sealed Sutton's Crossing's sinister reputation came that winter with the Mercer family. Jacob Mercer, a respected foreman at the Palmer Lead Mine, lived with his wife Elizabeth and his brother Isaiah about a mile from the bridge. They were an ordinary family, quiet, hard-working, and devout. Jacob had been with the mine for 15 years, and records from the Missouri Historical Society describe him as steady, rational, and dependable. His supervisor even wrote that Mercer demonstrates sound judgment even in crisis. The Mercers kept to themselves, attending church on Sundays, but rarely socializing otherwise. Elizabeth sold preserves at the Irondale General Store twice a month, while Isaiah, who had come from Tennessee after losing his wife to tuberculosis, helped with carpentry and repairs. Their small farm was tidy with a vegetable garden, a few apple trees, and 2 milk cows. Their home, built by Jacob in 1885, stood on a rise overlooking a tributary of the Big River, with a porch that faced toward the distant ridge, where Sutton's Crossing cut a dark line across the landscape. As winter settled in that year, the Ozarks were buried under heavy snow. Weather records from Springfield show temperatures below freezing from early December, with snow piling up to 18 inches by mid-month. Travel became nearly impossible, yet the Palmer mine pressed on. Jacob, living close enough to reach it, continued to make the treacherous daily crossing of the bridge. He never missed a day. On the morning of December 11th, 1900, he left home at 5:30 a.m. in the bitter cold, carrying his lantern as usual. He was seen at the mine that day working without incident and left at his normal hour. Fellow miners saw him walking toward the bridge at dusk. That was the last time anyone outside his household ever saw him alive. About 40 minutes later, Jacob reached home. But something was different. Elizabeth noticed it immediately. The man who entered their house that evening wasn't quite the same one who had left that morning. According to Elizabeth's later statement to Sheriff William Doherty, taken on January 3, 1901, Jacob seemed distant that evening, as if his mind were far away. She assumed he was simply tired from the long day and the bitter cold. But her journal, found years later, after she left Washington County, offered a more unsettling account. Jay returned late today, near 5:30, she wrote. His clothes were covered in snow more than the weather should have left on him. When I asked, he said he'd stopped on the bridge to listen to the river talking. I told him it was just the current under the ice. But he shook his head and said, no, it was using words. He ate nothing and went straight to bed. Over the next few days, Jacob's behavior began to change in subtle but disturbing ways. Isaiah Mercer, his brother, kept a personal journal during that time, which later became a key part of the investigation. On December 12th, he noted that Jacob had grown unusually quiet, often standing at windows long after dark, staring out toward the direction of Sutton's Crossing. Jay spoke only 12 words today, Isaiah wrote. When I speak to him, it takes him several moments to respond, as though he must come back from wherever his thoughts have gone. The following nights brought stranger behavior. On December 14th, Isaiah found Jacob awake at 3 a.m, standing motionless at the eastern window. When asked what he was looking at, Jacob simply said, "It's clearer at night. The other sounds don't interfere." On December 15th, he spent hours again gazing toward the bridge, telling Elizabeth only that it's calling. He refused to explain further. By the 17th, his condition worsened. Isaiah wrote that Jacob barely ate, and that morning he found the back door unlatched with a single set of footprints leading through the snow toward the bridge, but none returning. Yet Jacob was somehow back in bed when they awoke. He must have gone to the bridge in the night, Isaiah wrote, and come home another way. On December 18th, Jacob stopped speaking entirely. Isaiah's entry from that day described him as alert, but withdrawn, listening to something we cannot hear. The next night brought an even darker revelation. Isaiah discovered Jacob in the barn, drawing intricate geometric symbols on the wall in charcoal patterns so complex they seemed mathematical, almost architectural. When Isaiah approached Jacob, smeared them out, and walked past him without a word. Isaiah examined the markings after he left and noted their repeated triangular shapes that seemed to twist the eye if looked at too long. By December 20th, Jacob no longer went to work. Isaiah notified the mine that his brother had fallen ill, and the company granted him leave. Elizabeth's journal from December 21st painted a grim picture. Jay has not spoken in 2 days. He eats only when I place food in his hands. When we speak, he presses his palms over his ears, as if our words cause him pain. Yet at times, I see him turn his head toward the east, listening, always listening. On December 22nd, Dr. Samuel Parkman from Farmington braved the snow to reach the Mercer home. His notes preserved in county archives describe Jacob as physically strong, but mentally absent, his gaze fixed on nothing, as if waiting for a voice only he could hear. Dr. Parkman's notes describe Jacob Mercer as physically healthy, but mentally unreachable. Patient exhibits no fever or sign of physical distress, he wrote. Reflexes, normal pulse, steady breathing, even. Diagnosis, uncertain, possibly nervous exhaustion or the early onset of mental decline. He prescribed rest and a valerian root tonic, advising Elizabeth and Isaiah to monitor Jacob closely and contact him if his condition worsened. Yet the doctor added a peculiar note at the end of his report. Patient became momentarily alert when I mentioned crossing the bridge to reach the property. His only words during examination, "It waits there still." Upon further questioning, he lapsed back into silence. Days later, in a letter to a colleague in St. Louis, dated December 27, 1900, Dr. Parkman admitted he was baffled. "I confess myself perplexed by Mercer's case," he wrote. "There is no physical cause I can identify. Were it an isolated instance, I might suspect hysteria or brain fever. But his symptoms echo those of Thomas Holloway 12 years prior and 3 others from the same region since. All shared the same fixation with Sutton's Crossing and claimed to hear voices from it. I begin to suspect an environmental cause, perhaps mineral vapors or magnetic disturbance from the rock strata beneath the river." Jacob did not improve. Isaiah's journal entries over the following week paint a grim picture of escalating obsession. He noted that Jacob now spent long hours standing on the front porch, facing the direction of the bridge, unmoving, even in bitter cold. "Found Jay's boots caked with mud this morning," Isaiah wrote on December 28th. "He must be walking to the bridge at night. Elizabeth wishes to lock him in his room. I fear that would drive him further into madness." The next night, Isaiah followed him in secret. He walked straight to the bridge, steady as if guided. Stood in the center near 40 minutes, nodding at intervals as though agreeing with something unseen. Never spoke. Returned home unaware I was near. On December 30th, Jacob spent the day covering sheets of paper with intricate geometric symbols. Elizabeth asked what they meant, but he only placed his hand on one drawing and closed his eyes as if listening to vibrations. Isaiah later examined them himself and described the patterns as so complex they seemed to move flat lines, giving the illusion of impossible depth. Then came New Year's Eve. For the first time in weeks, Jacob spoke. "It's waiting for someone to listen properly," he said over supper. "I've been listening wrong. Tomorrow, I'll understand better." Elizabeth's journal noted how strange his voice sounded, lower, deliberate, as if each word came from somewhere else. When she expressed relief that he was speaking again, he looked at her with what she called a mix of pity and finality, and said, "The bridge knows things. It remembers what came before the wood, before the stone before us." He said nothing more. That night, Elizabeth woke to find Jacob's side of the bed empty. At first, she assumed he had gone outside, but when he didn't return, she woke Isaiah. Together, they searched the house, realizing his coat and gloves were still hanging by the door. Outside, the temperature had dropped below 0, yet Jacob had gone out in only his nightshirt and boots. Fearing the worst, they grabbed lanterns and followed his tracks through the snow towards Sutton's Crossing. When they reached the bridge around 2 a.m, they saw Jacob standing motionless in the middle of it. Both later swore he was speaking, gesturing, nodding, listening intently, though no one else was there. As they called his name, Jacob slowly turned toward them. Both Elizabeth and Isaiah would later tell authorities that Jacob's face just before he climbed the railing showed not despair or confusion, but a strange, almost serene certainty. Isaiah's final journal entry captured it in a single line. His eyes met mine. What I saw there was not madness, but clarity. He had found an answer, and it was enough for him. Isaiah tried to reach him, but was still 30 feet away when Jacob released his grip and dropped 60 feet into the partially frozen river. Despite frantic efforts to find him that night, Jacob's body remained missing until daylight. Elizabeth and Isaiah searched the banks with lanterns until the cold forced them home to summon help. Sheriff Doherty organized a search party at dawn. For 3 days they combed the river. On January 4th, Jacob's body was finally found a mile downstream, wedged against a tangle of timber. The coroner ruled drowning, but noted severe injuries consistent with striking rocks or ice before water entered the lungs. Sheriff Doherty's official report, filed January 7th, cited mental disturbance from unspecified natural causes and briefly alluded to similar incidents in the vicinity, but gave no detail. In the margin, a later handwritten note read simply, "Another one at the bridge. Third this year." What might have ended as a grim but straightforward tragedy instead deepened. Isaiah, shaken by his brother's death, began visiting Sutton's Crossing daily. Elizabeth's journal from January 9th records, "He returned with a peculiar light in his eyes. He spoke of patterns in the wood grain echoing Jay's drawings and formations in the rock beneath. It's not coincidence," he said. Sutton knew. He built it to resonate. By January 12th, Isaiah was spending entire days at the bridge, returning home numb from the cold, but seemingly unaware. He brought back splinters from the railing to study under magnification, arranging them in shapes identical to Jacob's sketches. When Elizabeth urged him to rest, he replied only, "There isn't time. It's already speaking to me too." On January 15th, she found him sleepwalking, standing at the same window where Jacob had once stared, swaying as if keeping time with some unheard rhythm. When she woke him, he murmured, "The bridge isn't the cause, it's a symptom," but refused to explain and remembered nothing in the morning. 3 days later, Isaiah approached Cornelius Washburn, editor of the Irondale Register, claiming to have critical information about the bridge's true nature. Washburn was known as a skeptical, methodical man, but he agreed to visit Sutton's Crossing the next day, perhaps for a human interest piece about the Mercer tragedy. His journal, later donated to the Washington County Historical Society, recorded the experience in vivid detail. On January 19th, Washburn and Isaiah arrived at the bridge shortly after noon. The weather was bitter, but clear. Washburn described Isaiah as agitated, yet focused, urging him to stay silent and just listen. For nearly half an hour, they stood without speaking. Washburn wrote that he was about to suggest returning to town when something extraordinary happened. The sound of the water below abruptly shifted. Instead of random noise, he wrote, there came a pattern, rhythmic undulations, almost speech. Though in no language I know, the sensation lasted perhaps 20 seconds, then faded. Washburn tried to dismiss it as acoustics or suggestion, but Isaiah's reaction was immediate. "You heard it," he said, "not clearly yet, but you heard it begin to speak." When Washburn suggested it was wind funneling through the gorge, Isaiah shook his head. "You need to listen longer," he said quietly. "It takes time to attune your perception." Washburn later wrote that Jacob Mercer had understood something toward the end, but he dismissed his own experience at the bridge as nothing more than suggestion and the tricks of sound. In his mind, the cold, the natural echo of the gorge, and Isaiah's unsettling conviction had combined to deceive his senses. When his article appeared in the Irondale Register on January 22, 1901, it contained no mention of voices or vibrations, only a sober account of the community's grief and renewed concern for bridge safety. Titled, "Local Man's Tragic End Highlights. Bridge Safety Concerns." The piece avoided all reference to Jacob's strange behavior before his death. It did, however, note that Sutton's Crossing had been the site of 17 documented accidents since 1879, far more than any other structure in the county. Isaiah Mercer, however, could not let the matter rest. He became convinced that the bridge was not merely dangerous, but alive, somehow conscious, aware, and perhaps even malevolent. Elizabeth's later testimony revealed that Isaiah spent the following weeks interviewing longtime residents, examining county archives, and collecting every mention of odd events tied to the crossing. By early February, his research filled their dining table. Elizabeth's journal from February 10th reads, "He has spread county records, newspaper clippings, and handwritten accounts across every surface. He claims a pattern incidents aligning with phases of the moon increasing in both number and severity since the bridge's completion." By mid-February, Isaiah's obsession deepened. He is now mapping the homes of those who experienced the bridge's effects, Elizabeth wrote on February 17th. He believes the influence radiates outward strongest at the center and weakening with distance. He has marked our home within what he calls the primary zone. Later entries show that Isaiah had developed a theory blending sound geometry and the limits of human perception. On February 26th, Elizabeth recorded, "He spoke at length about resonance frequencies and their effect on the mind. He believes the dimensions of the gorge create vibrations that alter the nervous system, and that the bridge's design amplifies these effects rather than dampening them." When I asked if this was accidental, he said no. Sutton knew. He built it to resonate. On March 3, 1901, Isaiah brought his findings to Sheriff Doherty, requesting an official inquiry. The sheriff's log confirms a 45-minute meeting that morning. No action was taken. Doherty later described Isaiah as a man consumed by grief, searching for reason in the irrational. Yet even he admitted in his private notes that Mercer's evidence was unsettling. While his conclusions are fantastical, Doherty wrote his data are not easily dismissed. The concentration of strange behaviors among residents within 1 mile of Sutton's Crossing is statistically irregular. Still, he concluded that a formal investigation would only stir panic and advised Isaiah to forward his research to the State University for review. Isaiah's investigation led to one final revelation, an anomaly in the bridge's construction. Records showed that its engineer Frederick Sutton had made a series of odd changes during the 1879 build. The spacing of the support beams was irregular, and iron rods had been added beneath the deck in precise intervals that served no structural purpose. The original blueprints which Isaiah uncovered in the county archives were far simpler. But in April 1879, Sutton himself had annotated the plans ordering the installation of iron resonators along the underside of the bridge. The revisions drove costs up by nearly 18%. Yet Sutton insisted they were essential. More chilling still, Isaiah discovered that shortly after the bridge's completion, Sutton had suffered a complete mental collapse. A St. Louis Post-Dispatch article dated November 12, 1879, reported that the engineer was committed to the Fulton State Asylum after attempting to destroy his own bridge, claiming it speaks with voices that should not exist. Before Irondale, Sutton had designed 6 other bridges across Missouri and Illinois, all sound, all ordinary, all free of strange events. County records praised him as meticulous and mathematically gifted, a man whose precision bordered on obsession. What made Sutton's Crossing different, Isaiah concluded, was not the man, but the land. The gorge's natural resonance, documented in an 1875 geological survey, had been well known even before construction. That report specifically warned that any bridge spanning the ravine should be built to dampen its acoustic properties, not amplify them. Sutton, for reasons unknown, had done the opposite. Sutton's design had ignored every warning the 1875 geological survey had issued. Instead of dampening the gorge's natural acoustics, he had amplified them. The uneven spacing of the support beams, the addition of iron resonators beneath the span, and even the railing's specific height appeared to be deliberate manipulations meant not for stability, but for sound. Where most engineers sought silence, Sutton had built a conduit for vibration. By April 1901, Elizabeth Mercer's situation had grown dire. In a statement to Reverend Thomas Grayson, recorded in his pastoral journal on April 10th, she confessed deep fear not of Isaiah, but for him. He speaks constantly of resonance and vibration, she said. He believes Sutton uncovered some link between structure and human thought. I fear he's following the same path that claimed Jacob. Reverend Grayson's entries describe Isaiah's condition in grim detail. He spent nearly every night at Sutton's Crossing, returning only in daylight to scribble notes and eat just enough to survive. He would lie face down on the bridge's center planks for hours, pressing his ear against the wood, as if listening to something whispering through the grain. He now claims to understand fragments of what it says the Reverend wrote. He believes full comprehension requires surrender. Elizabeth begged the minister to intervene, but she doubted Isaiah would accept spiritual counsel. On April 14th, Elizabeth's journal recounts one of their final encounters. He came home soaked, though the night was clear, she wrote. He moved feverishly about the house, sorting papers and rearranging drawings. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "It's shown me how the patterns connect at the bridge, in the land, in everything. The world hums with frequencies we've been trained not to hear." He took a small tuning fork from his pocket, struck it against the table, and held it near various objects, nodding as though confirming a truth only he could perceive. When the vibration faded, he looked at her with pity and said, "You can't hear it yet. Maybe that's a mercy." 3 days later, on April 17th, Isaiah Mercer vanished. Elizabeth discovered his bed untouched at dawn and notified Sheriff Doherty immediately. His notes and drawings were gone. When deputies searched the property, they found his coat hanging neatly over the same section of railing where Jacob had gone over 3.5 months earlier. The river below was swollen with spring rain, and though teams scoured several miles in both directions, no body was ever found. The official report concluded that Isaiah's remains were likely carried away by the current, possibly all the way to the Mississippi. Sheriff Doherty's final report, dated April 25th, contained a personal note rarely seen in official records. "Having now lost 2 men to this place, under nearly identical circumstances, I can no longer call it coincidence. Though reason demands a rational cause, I cannot dismiss the pattern. Additional warnings are posted and patrols increased. God help us if this continues." Elizabeth sold the Mercer property that June to a distant relative, James Carrington, for far less than it's worth. County documents suggest she simply wanted to leave. She moved to her sister's home in Springfield, Missouri, and lived there quietly until her death in 1943. Her family later told historian Margaret Welch that Elizabeth never spoke again of what happened at Sutton's Crossing, except once. Her sister's diary from 1902 records a single haunting sentence: "Lizzie woke screaming last night. When calmed, she whispered, 'Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed.'" Sutton's Crossing remained in use until 1917, when engineers declared it unsafe. Rather than repair the bridge, the county built a new one 1/2 mile upstream, leaving the old span to rot. It finally collapsed during a violent storm in 1924. Today, only its stone foundations remain half buried in the brush and nearly impossible to reach. Isaiah's research was never recovered. Locals say he burned it before he disappeared. But a legend persists, recorded in folklorist James Westfall's 1947 Ozark Shadows, that a trapper found Isaiah's notes in 1908, sealed in an oilskin pouch between 2 rocks near the bridge's base. No one ever saw the papers, and no trace of them was ever found. Only the story endures, whispered like the river beneath the ruins, waiting for someone else to listen. According to James Westfall's 1947 collection, Ozark's Shadows, the trapper who allegedly found Isaiah Mercer's lost papers, identified only as Old Man Carver, claimed the contents were so horrifying that he burned them on the spot. Westfall himself could never verify the story, and no surviving records corroborate it. Carver reportedly died in 1911, leaving no written account of what he had seen. But in Westfall's archived research notes at the University of Missouri, an interview with Carver's son adds a disturbing detail. The old man once described drawings that moved when you looked at them and numbers that made your head hurt to read. Whether fact or folklore, what distinguishes Sutton's Crossing from ordinary legend is the sheer volume of documented anomalies associated with it. County records show that between 1879 and 1917, the rate of fatal or unexplained deaths among those living within 1 mile of the bridge was nearly 8 times the national average. Even more unsettling was the concentration of mental disturbances reported in that same radius, disproportionately higher than in any nearby rural community. When the Washington County Health Department was founded in 1905, it began recording all reported medical cases. A later review of those records from 1905 to 1917 identified 47 cases of nervous disorders among residents near Sutton's Crossing. The descriptions were chillingly consistent. First came reports of hearing voices or auditory manifestations, followed by growing social withdrawal and fixation on geometric patterns or symbols. In almost 40% of cases, patients reportedly spoke of joining with the bridge, a phrase first documented by attending physicians as early as 1909. Dr. William Harrison, the county health officer from 1908 to 1916, addressed this trend in his 1912 annual report. The clustering of nervous afflictions near Irondale, particularly among residents proximate to Sutton's Crossing, constitutes a statistical anomaly demanding study. Environmental causes such as mineral emissions or contaminated water from mining operations may be contributing factors. Local officials, eager to avoid panic or superstition, quickly embraced Harrison's explanation. Blaming industrial contamination seemed far more reasonable than suggesting a haunted bridge. The Palmer lead mine, where Jacob Mercer had once worked, became the focus of an informal investigation by the Missouri Department of Mining in 1913. Soil tests confirmed elevated lead levels in the area, but failed to establish any link between contamination and the psychological afflictions reported. More telling was the spatial data. If mine pollution had been responsible, the highest concentration of illness would have been found near the mine itself. Instead, every documented case radiated outward from Sutton's Crossing in a near-perfect gradient, exactly the pattern Isaiah Mercer had mapped 12 years earlier. In 1914, the bridge's dark reputation deepened further. On the night of June 21st, the summer solstice townspeople reported an eerie event that remains one of the most unsettling episodes in local history. Archival photographs from the Irondale Register show about 20 residents gathered at Sutton's Crossing just after sunset. According to the newspaper's account, none had planned to meet. Each claimed to have been independently drawn by the sound, a low rhythmic hum rising from the bridge and the river below. Witnesses later described the vibration as words half formed a murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When Sheriff Michael Collins, who had succeeded William Doherty in 1910, questioned the 20 townspeople who had gathered at Sutton's Crossing that June night, none could explain why they were there. Each claimed to have felt an impulse or a sudden compulsion to go to the bridge, though none could recall when or why they began walking. What Collins and his deputies witnessed was even stranger. The group stood in a rough semicircle facing the center of the bridge, perfectly still and silent for nearly 40 minutes. No one spoke, moved, or seemed aware of the others. Then, as if on some unseen cue, they dispersed in silence, each heading home alone. When questioned the next day, none of the participants remembered the event clearly. Some described it as a half-dream, others as a momentary lapse in consciousness. Within 6 months, 3 of those individuals died in circumstances eerily similar to Jacob Mercer's: a fall from height, a disappearance near water, and an apparent drowning with no clear cause. In response, Sheriff Collins assigned deputies to monitor the bridge nightly through the rest of the summer. The gathering stopped, but the deputies themselves began filing troubling reports. Many described feeling unsteady or hollow while standing on the bridge, as if sound were being drawn out of the air. Others reported difficulty staying awake despite the cold. One deputy, James Wilson, resigned after a single night on duty, leaving behind a brief note: "I cannot live in a county that holds such a place." By 1915, local officials installed permanent warning signs at both ends of Sutton's Crossing: "Do not linger, no crossing after sundown." These measures reduced reports of incidents, but did not end them. Between 1915 and 1917, county records still documented 7 additional deaths and a dozen more cases of what physicians called acoustic delusions, auditory hallucinations, linked specifically to the bridge. The county finally decided to abandon the structure in early 1917, after engineers found several support beams dangerously weakened. The official report, dated March 12th, cited high repair costs as the reason for constructing a new crossing half a mile upstream. But letters preserved in the county archives suggest another motive. In one dated February 28th, Commissioner Thomas Blackwood wrote to his peers, "Beyond the structural concerns, we must acknowledge the persistent unease this bridge brings. A new crossing free from its associations would not only serve practical needs, but also symbolically close this chapter." The motion passed unanimously on March 15th. Construction began that spring and was completed by October. The new bridge, built under modern standards, contained none of Sutton's eccentric elements. No asymmetrical beams, no iron resonators, just straightforward, sturdy engineering. Sutton's Crossing, left to decay, slowly fell apart until the night of April 7th, 1924. That evening, an intense thunderstorm rolled through Washington County, and witnesses later described a sound like metal being torn in half, louder than any thunder. Moments later, the bridge collapsed, not piece by piece, but all at once, as if something had yanked it downward from below. In the days that followed, residents near the site reported a strange calm. Hiram Jenkins, whose farm bordered the eastern approach, told the Irondale Register, "The air feels lighter now. Birds are back where they wouldn't go before. It's like something that had been holding its breath for 40 years finally exhaled." Whether this was the clearing of an atmosphere long heavy with superstition, or the end of something that had truly been waiting beneath the bridge, remains a question that no official record has ever answered. After the collapse of Sutton's Crossing in 1924, something undeniable occurred. The strange pattern that had haunted the area for nearly 40 years abruptly ceased. County health records show that between 1924 and 1930, only 2 cases of psychological disturbance were reported within a 1-mile radius of the former bridge. A drastic decline from the decades when such afflictions had been 8 times the national average. For the first time in living memory, the Ozarks around Irondale returned to normal. Today, the stone foundations of the bridge still cling to the sides of the gorge, though the site is nearly lost to time. Dense vegetation and uneven ground make it difficult to reach, and trees now grow where the bridge's wooden approaches once stood. The gorge itself, once nearly 60 feet deep, has partially filled with silt, reducing its depth by about 15 feet and likely dulling the strange acoustics that once made it infamous. Still few locals venture near. Hunters, anglers, and hikers, normally at home anywhere in the Ozarks, avoid the area without explanation. When asked, they'll shrug and say there are better places to go, or they'll change the subject entirely. In 1963, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard of Washington University in St. Louis revisited Sutton's Crossing as part of a study on how geography might influence mental health. Her paper, published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology, proposed that certain geological formations could generate infrasound low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing that may influence the brain. The gorge beneath Sutton's Crossing, she wrote, was a textbook example. Using specialized recording equipment, Pritchard's team detected standing sound waves at several points along the ravine, with one node aligning exactly where the bridge's center once hung. Her report noted something extraordinary. When the team generated test tones of 18.9 Hz frequencies that matched the gorge's natural resonance, they each felt a creeping sense of unease, dizziness, and in 2 cases, faint whispering voices. The sensations vanished as soon as the sound stopped. The frequency, Pritchard wrote, appears to be uniquely amplified by the gorge's shape and may have been intensified by the bridge's specific dimensions. Her findings were controversial. Some colleagues dismissed them as experimental error or suggestion. Others argued that since the original bridge no longer existed, any conclusions were speculative. Pritchard's notes and recordings stored at the university were reportedly lost in 1968 during a facility reorganization. Later, researchers who attempted to replicate her results produced mixed outcomes. Some measured similar acoustic anomalies, while others found nothing out of the ordinary. Pritchard herself never returned. In a private letter written that September, she admitted, "I am reluctant to go back. My hesitation stems not from doubt, but from belief. I am beginning to suspect that some discoveries once glimpsed are better left alone." Despite skepticism, one fact remained uncontested between 1879 and 1917. 23 documented deaths were directly connected to Sutton's Crossing. 17 suicides and 6 accidents, and 31 additional cases of mental deterioration among those who crossed it daily. The bridge's name and the man who built it would forever be bound to those numbers. Frederick Sutton, the engineer who designed the bridge, spent the last 6 years of his life in the Fulton State Asylum after being diagnosed with acute melancholia with delusional features. Hospital records describe his fixation on geometry and sound. He refused to sleep in rooms with right angles, claiming that certain shapes opened doorways in the mind. He died in 1885 after refusing food, insisting it had been contaminated with bridge thoughts. During his confinement, Sutton produced hundreds of pages of diagrams, formulas, and notes, exploring the relationship between sound matter and consciousness. Most were destroyed in an 1894 fire, but 16 pages survived, preserved by his attending physician, Dr. James Hollister, who removed them for study. These fragments, now held in the Missouri State Archives, reveal a mind both brilliant and unhinged. One page, dated October 1880, reads, "The bridge was only a prototype proof that matter can be tuned to consciousness. Certain configurations act as conduits for frequencies beyond perception." The results exceeded all expectations, both wondrous and dreadful. Another, apparently an unsent letter, states, "What we call matter is but organized vibration held stable by rhythm. By introducing counter vibrations at specific points, one can disrupt the barrier between thought and reality." The bridge was a small demonstration. Larger structures could achieve greater effects. The most disturbing surviving fragment is a drawing, a redesign of Sutton's Crossing. It depicts the same trestle frame but augmented with complex iron coils, asymmetrical latticework, and a pattern of interconnected triangles forming a spiral across its span. Beneath it, in Sutton's precise handwriting, appear 3 words that no one has ever been able to explain. It listens still. Annotations found beside Frederick Sutton's final surviving drawing indicated that his redesigned bridge, had it ever been built, would have amplified the effect by an order of magnitude and established permanent conduits rather than temporary apertures. Whatever he believed he had discovered, it seems he thought Sutton's crossing was only a prototype for something far greater and infinitely more dangerous. The most unsettling aspect of the Sutton's Crossing mystery is not the number of tragedies, but the remarkable consistency in human behavior across 4 decades. Every documented case follows the same sequence: fascination, withdrawal, silence, and finally, the overwhelming urge to return to the bridge at night. Those who survive this final stage invariably describe the same experience, hearing voices or sometimes faint melodic tones rising from the structure itself. Modern science has offered more rational explanations. Some have argued that mass hysteria spread through a superstitious community already burdened by isolation and hardship. Others blame environmental toxins, particularly lead exposure from the nearby Palmer mine, where Jacob Mercer had worked. Yet this theory fails to explain why the incidents were confined to the narrow area surrounding the bridge and why they ceased completely after its destruction in 1924. A 1998 geological survey by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources offered another clue. The rock strata around the former bridge site contained unusually high concentrations of magnetite and certain rare earth elements known to exhibit piezoelectric properties, meaning they generate electric charges when subjected to mechanical stress. Some researchers have speculated that these minerals, combined with the gorge's unique acoustic resonance, could have produced fluctuating electromagnetic fields capable of subtly influencing brain activity, especially in the temporal lobes, the region associated with auditory processing and perception. Though compelling, this hypothesis remains unproven. No modern high-resolution electromagnetic mapping has ever been conducted at the site, and given the gorge's century of erosion and silt accumulation, the original environmental conditions may never be reconstructed. One final discovery deepened the mystery further. In 1965, during excavation for a flood control project near the old bridge foundations, workers uncovered a strange metallic object embedded within one of the original stones. The project engineer described it as cylindrical, about 6 inches long, etched with geometric markings and what appeared to be mathematical formulas. Most unusual was one end engraved with a series of concentric circles that created a disorienting illusion of depth, as if the metal were opening inward. The alloy was said to be lighter than steel, but equally hard, and the cavity in which it was found appeared to have been deliberately cut rather than formed by time or decay. The object was shipped to the University of Missouri for analysis, but vanished in transit. No photographs were ever taken, and no official record of its arrival exists. The only detailed description survives in a statement given by project supervisor Raymond Thornton to the Irondale Register, where he remarked, "It looked like something designed for a very specific purpose by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Frederick Sutton's surviving notes contain no mention of such an artifact. But given how much of his work was destroyed after his institutionalization, its absence proves nothing. The craftsmanship, Thornton described precise mathematical and purpose-built aligns eerily well with Sutton's known skills and obsessions. Today, the location of the original Sutton's Crossing has faded into obscurity. The replacement bridge, built in 1918, widened in 1956, still carries light traffic without incident. The gorge below is quieter now, its depth reduced by nearly 15 feet, its once resonant walls muted by time and silt. Yet despite the passage of generations, local attitudes have not changed. Few residents venture there after dark, and even fewer are willing to talk about why. A 1968 survey by the Washington County Historical Society found that 87% of respondents from Irondale and surrounding communities considered the original bridge site unwholesome or best left undisturbed. When pressed for elaboration, one respondent, a grandson of a former mine worker, summed up what many still feel more than a century later. Whatever was under that bridge, he said, wasn't meant for people to listen to. The unease surrounding Sutton's Crossing never truly vanished. It merely settled into the bones of the place. Even generations removed from the last recorded tragedy, local families continue to speak of the site with the same wary reverence once reserved for haunted ground. It isn't the kind of fear born of folklore, but something older and quieter. A cultural memory passed down in hushed tones. Ask an elder in Irondale, and they might simply say, "Some places don't sit right with the world." Beyond that, they rarely elaborate, especially with outsiders. In 1977, a graduate student from the University of Missouri's Folklore program traveled to Washington County to collect oral histories about the old bridge. His field notes, preserved in the university archives, tell a consistent story of avoidance. Residents who spoke freely about ghost lights, witches, and other Ozark legends grew tense the moment Sutton's Crossing was mentioned. Some ended interviews abruptly. Others gave brief, non-committal answers before changing the subject. It was not ignorance, he wrote. It was refusal. They knew more than they were willing to say. And so the same questions remain as unresolved now as they were a century ago. What truly happened at Sutton's Crossing? Was it merely an unfortunate intersection of geology, acoustics, and psychology? A natural resonance that tricked the senses and preyed on the mind? Or did Frederick Sutton, through brilliance or madness, build something that reached beyond the physical world into the fragile threshold of human consciousness? No answers survive. Isaiah Mercer's body and research were never found, and whatever knowledge Sutton believed he had uncovered perished with him in the asylum. The bridge itself is gone, its remnants swallowed by earth and time, the stone foundations standing only as mute witnesses to the story they once supported. Elizabeth Mercer's warning, whispered in her sleep over a century ago, still hangs over the tale. Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed, not only in the literal sense, but in understanding. Some mysteries resist explanation, not because they defy science, but because they mark the edge of what the human mind can safely explore. Even now, on certain windless nights, locals claim the gorge whispers again. They say the sound is faint, but rhythmic too, ordered to be the river, too strange to be the wind. A murmur that rises and falls like language from a dream. Those who hear it turn away quickly, unwilling to listen for long. No one stands at the center of the new bridge after dark. Not anymore.